Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Demystifying Safeguarding Investigations, organized by the Safeguarding Hub Eastern Europe. My name is Elena Cofaru, and I'm the national representative of the Hub in Romania, as well as your host today. For those of you who are not familiar with the mission and activities of Safeguarding Hub Eastern Europe, I would like to mention that this program is a resource for organizations as well as individuals who are involved in the humanitarian response to the war in Ukraine. We provide practical and accessible safeguarding resources and aim to reduce harm to refugees and displaced people in Ukraine. For more information, I encourage you to visit our platform, available also in Romanian. Over the past 16 months, people in Eastern Europe have mobilized in order to help and welcome refugees and displaced people who were fleeing the war in Ukraine. Many organizations, large and small, have become involved in the humanitarian response. We who work in the humanitarian community, we know, unfortunately, that in times of crisis, harm can be done by the humanitarian staff as well. These harms can include sexual exploitation and abuse, discrimination, or harassment. In the Safeguarding Hub Eastern Europe, we use the term safeguarding, which refers to measures of prevention and response to harm caused by people involved in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. You may also hear other terms, such as PCEA, meaning protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, but we usually use the term safeguarding. Administrative investigation of allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse and of other forms of abuse is a common tool used in the safeguarding response. United Nations and international non-governmental organizations use common principles and standards to conduct administrative investigations on CEA, meaning sexual exploitation and abuse and other safeguarding issues. You're welcome to ask questions in order to demystify this process. We want this webinar to clear and to clarify uncertainties in order to gain a comprehensive understanding of the resources we need to start with in order to conduct an an administrative investigation. So today's first guest is Lucy Haven Taylor, a senior consultant with over 20 years of experience in safeguarding and protection from sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in humanitarian and development sector. Lucy began her career in the conflicts that took place in Bosnia and Kosovo. She worked with survivor-centered safeguarding investigation, which she prepared in collaboration with the Safeguarding Hub Eastern Europe. In her presentation, Lucy will introduce basic concepts and terms related to the subject of safeguarding investigations, including the principles of equity and survivor-centeredness. She will also explain the steps that can be followed in an administrative investigation. The full biographies of the two guests are available on our website. And now I would like to give the floor to Lucy to begin her presentation.
Thank you so much, Elena, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. So Mariam, if we could move to the first slide, please. And the next, this one. Okay, so you will have heard a lot, I think, about safeguarding investigations in our sector. It's something that our donors are talking a lot about. There's a lot of interest in this, and we're hearing a lot that investigations is something that we should be aware of and should be doing as part of our work on safeguarding. So the purpose of this webinar is to demystify what we mean by safeguarding investigations and to take you through exactly when we should be doing a safeguarding investigation and what will happen when we do one. So to start with, going right back to the basics, what actually is a safeguarding investigation? So in our sector, a safeguarding or PSEA investigation is a workplace administrative investigation. So it's not a legal investigation, it's a workplace investigation that we undertake as employers. And it takes place when further information is required to find out whether a staff member or a volunteer or someone working on behalf of our organisation has breached our organisation's code of conduct or safeguarding or PSEA policy. Next slide, please, Mariam. Thank you. So just to recap on the terminology that we use, Elena has already referred to some of it, but just to go through it again. So as Elena mentioned, we use the term safeguarding. It can be a term that's difficult to translate. In fact, to let you know that even in English, it's not a commonly known or understood term, but it is the one that we use in our sector that best covers what we mean by the work that we're doing. And we use it to mean preventing harm caused by our staff or our volunteers or our programme design and implementation. So we understand that we are here as humanitarian and development organisations to help people who are fleeing from the war in Ukraine. But unfortunately, there can be a small minority of people who use these circumstances to cause harm. And by harm, this can be physical, emotional, or sexual harassment, exploitation, or abuse. Elena mentioned PSEA. Some of you will be familiar with this term, protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. And this refers to protection from sexual exploitation and abuse by our staff and volunteers. So it's a subset of safeguarding. It's a particular type of harm that we're focused on when we look at PSEA. We will be using the term survivor. This refers to the person who is or has been sexually exploited or otherwise abused. We use the term survivor because we feel that it's an empowering term. Some people prefer to refer to themselves as victims, or you will see other terms used. And of course, the person who's experienced the harm or sexual exploitation and abuse should be the person who chooses how they describe their experience. However, we will be using survivor in the presentation. Survivor-centred means that the survivor's wishes, safety and well-being remain a priority in all matters and procedures. So that's just a reminder on the terms. If we could move to the next slide, please, Mariam. Thank you. So when does an investigation take place? So first of all, as I've said, we are talking about workplace investigations. So first of all, we're looking at, was this safeguarding incident, possibly because we might not know yet, was it perpetrated by our organisation's staff or volunteers or someone associated with our organisation? If it wasn't, and we're just hearing about a protection concern or a safeguarding concern that relates to the wider community, then of course we would simply refer it to the relevant authorities in Romania who are responsible for these types of harm. If it's possible that it was our staff member or volunteer or somebody associated who has caused this safeguarding incident, then our next question that we want to ask is, does this incident potentially represent a breach of the law in Romania? Is this something like sexual assault that is simply against the law? And again, rather than dealing with it internally, we need to refer it to the authorities. Now, there might be a question here, particularly when we're dealing with sensitive issues of sexual exploitation, abuse and assault, that there might be circumstances where we feel it's not safe or protective to refer this to the authorities. So that would need to be a decision that you would need to think about in your organisation. Might it actually cause further harm if we refer this case to the authorities? But as a rule, that's what we should be doing. If this incident doesn't represent a breach of a law, so for example, our codes of conduct might prohibit things that are not against the law, but that we consider exploitative and things that should not be done by people who are in a position of power whilst they're working for our organisations. So, for example, we hear of cases where our staff might request sex or a sexual relationship in return for giving assistance. In the eyes of the law, this might be a consensual relationship between two adults. But because we're in a position of power as humanitarian organisations, this is usually prohibited by our codes of conduct. So in this case, the next question to ask would be, do we have enough information to make an immediate decision? For example, have we all seen something happened? Everyone on the staff saw it happened. It's an immediate dismissal. With safeguarding incidents, particularly sexual exploitation and abuse, it's not always obvious what exactly has happened. So if we need to find out more in order to make a decision about whether we're going, for example, to disciplinary procedures, then we might need to undertake an investigation. So next slide, please, Mariam. Next slide, please. So workplace investigations are something that all organisations undertake. Mariam, can we have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry. Beg your pardon, it's there. Sorry, could you go back, Mariam? I was looking at the wrong screen. Back one more. No, that's the right one, sorry. My copy is in English, so I'm needing to follow up. Many apologies, Mariam, you had it correctly first of all. So we undertake workplace investigations for all kinds of issues, such as fraud or bullying or harassment. But what is specific about a safeguarding investigation? Well, there are certain things that we need to consider. There's a risk of re-traumatization of the survivor and also potentially of other witnesses. There might also be potential safety and security risks to the survivor or the people involved in the case. As mentioned, safeguarding incidents, and particularly sexual exploitation and abuse, tend to be an abuse of power. That means that quite often the perpetrator is a powerful person, and they might be considering retaliation or threatening or coercing the survivor if they come forward, or indeed other people in the case. Another thing to consider is, of course, that the survivors in this case, they might be our members of staff if we're looking at workplace harassment, or they might be beneficiaries. And in either case, different policies and legal obligations may apply. If we are looking at sexual harassment in the workplace, so our staff member is a perpetrator and also the person experiencing the sexual harassment is a member of our staff, then there are specific workplace legislations and policies that deals with that. If our staff member is exploiting or abusing a member of the public, there will be different policies involved. Next slide, please, Mary. So what happens when a safeguarding investigation takes place? First of all, before we do anything else, before we've even decided what next steps we're going to take, or if we can uphold this allegation of safeguarding, the first thing that we do is we offer support to the survivor, and that's a survivor-centred approach. So this support might be legal support, psychosocial support, medical support, and we are doing that without prejudice. We're doing that first of all, and also for as long as the survivor needs it. Secondly, we are assigning roles and responsibilities for this investigation. Now, the important thing here is that there is a separation of duties between the person who manages the investigation, or the team who manage the investigation, and the team who carry out the investigation. And we recommend a minimum of 2 people. The reason that we separate these duties is for transparency, to make sure that the decisions made are entirely transparent and that there is no conflict of interest involved in the investigation. You do not need to have legal expertise to manage an investigation. However, it is important if somebody in your organisation, for example, if you have a legal counsel or your HR team to check that your policies and procedures, of course, are in line with Romanian workplace legislation. The investigation manager then develops the terms of reference. The investigation team then review the information and develop a plan for the investigation. Now, there might be what we call documentary information involved in the investigation. So that might be things like WhatsApp messages or documents that relate to the investigation. But generally, the majority of information we're collecting is from witnesses. So that includes the survivor themselves, other people who might have specific information to give. Maybe the survivor confided in them after the assault or the incident. Maybe they saw something suspicious in their colleague's behavior, but it's a very limited number of people that we are specifically interviewing because we think they might have relevant information. And of course, we will interview the person against whom the safeguarding allegation has been made, our member of staff. We need to enable due process, so it's very important that they have their chance to put across their side of the story, their information relating to the incident. And then we gather all that information to make a decision. So all the information is collated and analysed to come up with a report and conclusions. We then give that report to the investigation manager, who makes a decision based on the report. And remember, we have the separation of duties here. So both the investigators and the investigation manager have to agree on what they think the outcome of the investigation is. We can move to the next slide, please, Marion. So back where we are, thank you. So at the beginning, Elena said that we would be looking at a survivor-centred approach to investigation. So all of the processes that I've talked you through are designed to be survivor-centred, but there are also specific things that we can do to make sure that we are survivor-centred. These recommendations have arisen from a report that I co-authored recently for CHS Alliance, looking at step-by-step in responding to a safeguarding report or concern. How can we be more survivor-centred? And the recommendations that we came out with from the research are, first of all, of course, to consider that survivors are experts in their own situation and they know what's best for them. That organisations should consider whether an investigation is in fact necessary or whether there are other options, given that an investigation can be re-traumatising for a survivor, particularly if it's not done professionally. Connected with that, investigations should proceed with the informed consent from the survivor. They can participate or not in the investigation. It is possible to carry out investigations without the participation of the survivor. It might be more difficult, but it is something that can be done. And I have done that in the past. Survivors have a right to be accompanied by a support person if they wish to be. This support person will be separate from the investigation, and they're there simply to provide support to the survivor and help them navigate the investigation process. Investigations should follow sector standards, and again, as mentioned, should not cause further trauma. And the way to do this is to use trained investigators and to follow the sector-specific standards and procedures. Finally, investigations should use, where possible, balance of probability to make decisions. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about what we mean by that. So next slide, please, Marion. Thank you. So balance of probability is a threshold of evidence. In other words, it's the threshold we use to make a decision about whether something did or did not happen. And as many of you will be aware, in a court of law, we usually use beyond reasonable doubt as a threshold for decision making. However, we are talking about workplace investigations. Now, some organisations, particularly UN organisations, do use a very high threshold of evidence. So some do use beyond reasonable doubt or similarly high thresholds. In a workplace investigation, however, we usually use balance of probability. Now, this means that something is more likely to have happened than not. So when our investigation manager is looking at our investigation report and seeing if they agree with the conclusions, they're looking at the information and they are saying, yes, I agree with the investigation team. It seems more likely than not, based on the information provided, that this is what did or didn't happen. The reason we recommend using balance of probability is that it is easier to come to conclusions when we're doing a workplace administrative investigation into safeguarding or sexual exploitation and abuse matters. Beyond reasonable doubt or higher thresholds of evidence are much harder to prove, particularly in these kind of sensitive cases. Next slide, please, Marion. Thank you. So what happens next after you've undertaken your investigation? Well, as we've said, the decision is made on what to do next based on the investigation conclusions. There are usually three potential conclusions. It varies slightly from organisation to organisation, and they might word it differently. But generally speaking, we are looking at either the safeguarding allegation is upheld due to information on the balance of probability to prove the allegation. It might be not upheld due to information, again, on the balance of probability to disprove the allegation. Or the third possible outcome could be that the allegation is not upheld due to insufficient information to prove the allegation. So the responsibility is always on us as the employer to prove on the balance of probability that the allegation can be upheld before we take any action. If we cannot prove on the balance of probability that it happened, then the conclusion is that no further action is taken. If we uphold the allegation, then usually it goes to a disciplinary hearing as per your organisation's procedures. As I said, if it's not upheld, either because it's disproved or there's simply not enough information to uphold it, then that staff member or volunteer's record is cleared. Of course, the other thing that happens is that we continue with support for the survivor as long as they want to access it. And then finally, justice for the survivor. I've put a question mark by this because this is a less clear area in the work that we do. How do we compensate a survivor for harm caused by our staff or associated personnel? This is a question of debate in our sector. Are we financially liable? Can they seek compensation? Should we be looking at other avenues, such as restorative justice? These are some of the things that are currently being discussed. But it's worth considering that if we, as an employer, cause harm, for example, one of our drivers causes a road traffic accident, then quite often there is liability associated with that. So should we be looking at a similar liability if there is harm caused by our staff in terms of physical or sexual or emotional harassment, exploitation, or abuse? Next slide, please. Marion, thank you. So quite a lot of issues raised there, and I'm sure you might have questions about all of that. Of course, Raluca is going to talk us through safeguarding specifically in Romania. So she's might be going into more detail about some of these issues, but a reminder that there is further help available. The Safeguarding and Resource and Support Hub has a site in Romanian, and there are plenty of resources that you can access there. There is also support available from the help desk in Romanian, and you can find further information from the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub. So I will leave it there for the moment and hand over to Elena, who will be introducing Raluca, your next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for this presentation, for the concepts, for the terms and the steps related to administrative investigation. But before turning to Raluca, I would like to remind you and also encourage you to formulate your questions in the chat box. Sorry, in the Q&A chat box that is available there. So now turning to Raluca, I would like to present her. Raluca Verweijen-Slamnescu, she's a national expert in safeguarding who has more than 25 years of experience in the field of development cooperation and the development of support and protection services for children and families in need. Raluca has been involved in strategic program planning, development of child protection policies and services, as well as in the development and implementation of safeguarding policies of various NGOs. Raluca will talk today about the challenges of safeguarding in Romania and how they affect administrative investigation. Raluca, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Elena. I would like to share a couple of remarks that I bring to you based on my practice, based on the activities I participated in Romania, but also from other countries. But mostly I would like to focus on Romania. So I guess the presentation held by Lucy really raised a series of questions. And now I would also like to encourage you to formulate your questions in the Q&A chat box. In many professional contexts, investigations are carried out based on disciplinary measures, as the way how Lucy has mentioned. But investigation has an even more important role. And basically, we need to see them as responsibility processes. What does it mean? Investigations help us to offer the necessary support to survivors, be whether they are part of our programs, beneficiaries, or they are our colleagues, or they're volunteers or members of our partner organizations with whom we are working when implementing our projects. Investigations also help us to eliminate, to minimize the safeguarding risks and have proper reactions to these kind of cases. And of course, investigations, the scope of an investigation is to lead us to a series of lessons, recommendations that we can use in order to improve our safeguarding policies within our organizations. In a couple of minutes, and I promise not to speak too largely in order to have time for Q&A, I would like to present you a couple of remarks, observations that I prepared. So the first category of challenges refers to the vulnerability of our beneficiaries. So these are people, refugees coming from Ukraine, or people living with disabilities, children in need of care, or women belonging to different ethnic groups, people depending to different ethnic groups. So these are different vulnerabilities, and in many cases, organizations are the only institution, the only organization that can provide support to them. Of course, they might be hesitant, they might be avoidant in mentioning safeguarding cases, fearing for missing out on the support that they might get from our organization. So the abuse, the harassment are very common cases, and they identify them as some negative experience, or due to the fact that they have seen that even when they turn with their remarks to the organizations, to the law enforcement institutions, they feel that they're being left alone. So the second level of challenges is gender discrimination. So maybe you heard about the question whether in a situation when we're talking about the safeguarding incident, how was the victim dressed? This is the questions we are hearing. Was she provoking? Was she wearing makeup? So all these questions make us understand that gender discrimination is very present, not only as in professional context as well as in any other. Of course, men can also be victims of gender discrimination, but there is a vulnerability of people who have a different sexual orientation than the majority of the population, and the tendency to blackmailing them in these contexts of investigation or in a situation when they would want to report an incident, a harassment, they are threatened with outing them as people belonging to minorities who have different sexual orientations, obviously talking about persons who did not come out yet. And another case that I would like to mention here is connected to a certain way of how the practices of the civil organizations, because in many cases, these organizations are viewed as organizations that are doing good. So this means that they cannot make any errors. There cannot have cases of harassment. So I would like to mention that this is also not lacking errors and accidents and incidents, and we need to be clear about that. Those people who are working with beneficiaries themselves have been victims of abuse. So they went through this trauma, and this influences a lot the way they are relating to survivors. So when they are faced with new cases of survivors and victims and new cases of harassment, they are feeling re-traumatized. And I think that we also have this miscommunication legacy that we have from state socialist times. And of course, we tend to uh, consider these situations as taboo. So this makes the investigation and the management of this situation even more difficult. So if we know, the less we know about a certain case, then the more difficult it is for us to conduct an investigation. So trusting an organization to solve a situation, it's crucial. And last but not least, I think it's important to talk about the financial resources that are quite limited. So we need services, we need professionalism, we need time. So we need time in order for our organizations to have these kind of resources. And based on my experience, even if when I saw organizations, when there were policies, mechanisms of integrity of the whistleblowers, so nonetheless, they were lacking the financial resources that would be dedicated to support the survivors or other supporting activities. And the organization obviously has a responsibility both towards the survivor, both towards the perpetrator. So what are we going to do now? So I mentioned a couple of challenges to which there are a series of different responses, but I would like to present a couple of steps, a couple of ideas. For instance, improving the awareness and professionalizing the response to PCEA and the process, how we develop that, it's very important. It's the most important. How we involved the programs, the employees, the volunteers. How do we harmonize these policies with the legislation and international legal framework? So this is something that we are doing in our safeguarding practices. It's very important to have a contact person for safeguarding, but it's also very important for that person to be well trained, to have the proper capacities to react, and to have a proper email address and phone number that is known by everybody, by beneficiaries as well. So we need action plans as well. This might sound boring, but everything that is not included in the action plan does not benefit from any financial support, and we need to do that. So even in areas where safeguarding is not that much included, we need to focus on including that in order to rethink our safeguarding. We also need budget for that. So in the humanitarian network framework, in the Ukraine response context, we saw that safeguarding had to adapt to the situation that the war in Ukraine caused. We need to focus and we need to be aware of our own traumas and how we are focusing on our beneficiaries in the awareness of our own traumas. And if I would just like to mention another aspect, and now I would like to read a quote from an Austrian manager, which says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So how do we carry out solid investigations? How do we make sure that these investigations do not vanish in our organization? So these investigations are very important, and I think the most important aspect I would like to draw attention to is to acknowledge that no matter how well prepared organization is, nonetheless, safeguarding incidents might show up. So we should never not focus on safeguarding measures because these are very important. I also think that leaders need to lead by example, by transparency, by respect, by a transparent way of communicating about what is happening, what is going on, also about the investigations and safeguarding incidents. And these are the topics that I think we should be talking about more in the future. It's also important to focus a lot on survivors, as Lucy said it. So there's a tendency in management to safeguard the reputation of the organization, and I think that's very badly done. I think our focus needs to be always on the survivor and on our responsibility and role in supporting our beneficiaries. Also, leaders, I think, should be able to motivate their members of the board and making them aware of their role in maintaining safeguarding processes, in conducting investigations, in assuming the lessons that are being learned and how these are being incorporated in future safeguarding plans. And there are a series of different topics that we have seen in among the managers, because they're meeting every now and then. They talk about the way they're carrying out their work. And I think safeguarding should be one of their topics. And in Austria, where I'm very active, also, I do encourage the managers to call in an expert on safeguarding, be it from their country or from another country, and have very honest and open conversation about the challenges they face in this safeguarding topic. I'm very happy to have had the chance to be here, and I would like to now answer your questions. Thank you very much for such an informative presentation. Now, my suggestion is to give the floor to the questions and answers. I've seen there are a series of questions already written there. Nonetheless, I would like to prioritize two questions that I received beforehand, after which I will take in also the questions from the Q&A box. And of course, people who want to intervene live by raising their hand and formulating their questions will be next. What kind of recommendations do you have for those organizations who are carrying out investigations when the victim survivor is not willing to be part of the investigation? How can, in such a case, the organization carry on an investigation focused on the survivor? And these questions are addressed to both of our presenters.
So I think there are two possibilities here. First of all, we say that in order to follow a survivor-centered approach, we should get consent from the survivor before undertaking an investigation. That's the default position. Just to add, that doesn't apply if the survivor is a child under the age of 18. We always act in the best interests of the child, so we will follow up and refer the case as appropriate. However, with an adult, we do seek consent. However, if the survivor doesn't consent for us to do anything at all, to take the investigation further in any way, then that puts us in a difficult position, because we want to respect the wishes of the survivor. But also there's a possibility that amongst our staff or volunteers, there is a person who's causing harm to beneficiaries that they come into contact with. And we're responsible and accountable for that. So in that particular circumstance, we might need to make some difficult decisions as an organisation. We might decide that there are steps that we take even without the survivor's consent. But of course, that's a difficult decision to be made and needs to be made with advice from safeguarding experts and with sign-off from senior management. If the survivor consents for an investigation or follow-up to go ahead but does not want to be involved, then that's a situation that we find ourselves in some occasions. It does happen. And we can undertake an investigation, and we should undertake an investigation. And that means going through all the processes and procedures in order that we have something documented, we have an investigation, so that, for example, if similar cases come up in the future, or we are asked for a reference, that we have some kind of paperwork that shows that we followed due process there. It is harder to reach a conclusion if the survivor is not involved, but not impossible. So I have undertaken investigations where the survivor was not involved. However, there were witnesses that had seen certain events and incidents happening. There might also, in some cases, be witnesses who maybe did not see the incident occur, but maybe the survivor spoke to them directly afterwards. Perhaps the survivor appeared to be distressed and gave an account of what happened. And sometimes we can gather enough information that way to determine that on the balance of probability, we think, yes, this incident did occur. So it is difficult, but absolutely not impossible. But the important thing is, when we receive a report, we must act on it in some way, whatever those next steps are.
So a couple of comments to add to what Lucy said. So it's important to understand the reasons why the survivor does not want to consent in participating in an investigation. So based on my experience, what I've seen is that it's very important who is asking the main and first questions. So we need to make sure that these first questions are addressed by a right person. So whether that person is a man or a woman, it's very important whether these talks are happening in the familiar environment, whether they are happening within the organization. So it's very important to understand whether that person is living with disabilities or needs an interpreter and translator. So all these channels of communication themselves can hinder or can motivate the survivor to consent in the investigation. It's also very important to understand how will we prove that we are respecting their confidentiality, that we are respecting the survivor in all of their needs. And we have seen that the fact that there is a contract in which us as organization, we grant the access to healthcare services, psychiatry, psychologists, and so on, and also legal support. These are aspects that really strengthen us as an organization, and maybe also can help the survivor to give consent in order to participate in the investigation. Thank you very much to both of you. I think this was questions that I've formulated, and I encountered this question in many cases when we were talking with the different NGOs. And heading towards the second question, does services of a team of investigations, the fees, sorry, of the administrative investigation can be quite high, and it's possible that organizations cannot afford it. So what do you recommend for an NGO that is a smaller NGO or medium NGO? How should they react? What is that they should be doing when they do not have enough financial tools for that? So my question is, what does high cost mean? And what does the cost of investigation, what does that mean? And what does it mean? What consequence does it have when we do not carry out an investigation? How does that affect our organization? And at the end, this might lead to withdrawing the finances that the organization benefits from its donors. So what does costs mean?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Raluca. Yeah, investing a little can certainly sort of save a lot in the long term. But it is true that it's not cost neutral. There is cost associated with it, and if you are bringing in external investigators, particularly internationally, so you're factoring in travel costs as well, it can be expensive to bring in external investigators. The aim is, of course, that investigation expertise is local. It's available within Romania, and the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub, and also other organisations and networks I know as well, are really working to build that capacity, that specialisation in investigating workplace safeguarding concerns within Romania. So in the future, hopefully there will be local, a wider range of local practitioners available. And the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub also has a consultants directory that I believe they're populating with local consultants that you can use. But of course, consultants still come with the cost incurred. So another option is, as much as possible, to have staff trained internally within the organisation who can do this. But yes, that's something that we're working on, an aspiration to build that capacity rather than something that might be in place right now.
Thank you very much for the replies. And I would like to look at the questions that we received from the audience. Lucy, I would like to look at the first question because it's already written in English and it is addressed to you. And I will translate it into Romanian. What are the recommendations in a case when the subject concern, Lucy, I would like also for you to address the abbreviation. So the perpetrators. So what happens when the allegations prove to be malicious and unsubstantiated? And I think, Lucy, I would like to ask you to explain us what unsubstantiated means, what an unsubstantiated allegation means. And the question goes on by asking, at what point do we provide support to the alleged perpetrator when the allegation proved to be malicious? Because it might be the case that the alleged perpetrator suffers emotional distress.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great question. Just before I go to the question, just to point out that I have put a link in the chat box to an OCHA investigation fund that people can apply for if they need funding for investigations. There are very specific requirements in order to be able to access that fund. I think in terms of you need to be getting funding from certain UN bodies, but it's worth looking at. And I think there are other sources of funding as well for organisations for investigations out there. So please do have a look and see if you can get support on that. And also to say that if you don't have to ask me questions in English in the Q&A, if you have a question you want to write it in Romanian, please do go ahead and our interpreter can interpret that for me. So Elena's question about the terminology there, SOC. So SOC means subject of complaint or subject of concern. And that means the person against whom the allegation has been made, our perpetrator. So our staff member against whom there has been an allegation made of breach of code of conduct or safeguarding policy. So what to do if the allegation is proved to be malicious or unsubstantiated? First of all, although in my experience this does happen, it is relatively rare and balanced against the number of particularly incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse that go unreported. It's very, very unusual to have a malicious allegation. So just to say that first of all, it's much more usual that by the time somebody comes to the point where they're willing to come forward and make an allegation of sexual exploitation and abuse, they've already overcome so many barriers that it's unlikely to be malicious. It is important, of course, that we follow due process in order to ensure whether reports are malicious or not. At what point do we provide support to the SOC? Well, we should be providing support to our SOC from the beginning of the investigation. At the beginning of the investigation, we don't know whether or not the allegation is upheld. And this person is our staff member. And we do, of course, have a duty of care to them, not only to follow due process in this case, but also to provide any other support they might need, such as the person asking the question mentioned, psychosocial support. So this should absolutely be made available to the person against whom the allegation has been made. Raluca, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
Yes, indeed. We've seen a series of, or a high number of unsubstantiated allegation, and especially this happens with our employees who used to work for our organizations and they left in a conflict loaded situation. So there is a specific aspect that mentions the reaction. What do we do in a case when we are facing an unsubstantiated allegation? So what are the consequences, both when former employees are involved or beneficiaries are involved? I wanted to draw attention about this aspect because it seems to me that the NGO sector in Romania and of social services providers need to be very careful and need to focus on these cases, and they need to focus on the safeguarding cases that occurred in different organizations, cases of abuse, and how they were handled. So this really are showing us and teaching us for the future and informs the beneficiaries in their decision to turn towards us. So in Austria, the situation is more or less similar. I would like to talk about one last question, so like give space to one more question. So this question came in Romanian, whether we met certain correlation lacks or these correlations between international safeguarding and labor law in Romania. So what are the solutions? So we can find solutions all the time. In one of our future webinars, I wanted to mention that Elena works in Romania and she's very happy to work on developing safeguarding in Romania. So of course there is a lack of this harmony in between safeguarding, international safeguarding, labor law, and the way labor law is applied. So I believe, and this is what we've seen with Elena in the seminars that we held together, that there are many different aspects in the Romanian legislation that would help us to have a very fast reaction in safeguarding incidents, even within very small organization, but be that they are not named as harassment cases, they are not named as such properly, or people do not know whom to turn to, then they do not know how to manage. So I don't know whether this reply is very helpful, but on a general level, I think we need more education, more interest, and I think we need more focus for in the top management, in the administrative councils, in the boards, and also encouraging the victims and survivors to make use these services. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Raluca. So my suggestion is to head towards our conclusions and the questions that we were not able to reply to. We will be replying them via email. But now I would like to thank you for participating in our webinar. Finally, I would just like to remind you that on our website, do you find the different resources that can help you in solving, in addressing different safeguarding incidents. And also you can address our help desk where you can ask for support in safeguarding, and you can benefit of free counseling from an expert. And also you can address and contact me where we can communicate and collaborate in the future as well. Thank you very much. And I would like to wish you a pleasant afternoon. Bye.